Hey, welcome back to Lick of the Week videos. We're continuing in our study of partial chord shapes, in particular stroke style application for partial chords. Last video we looked at the F shape position and we broke it down into usable chunks, or what we call partials, fragments, whatever term you like to use, which basically just means that we're taking a full-blown shape and making smaller pieces of it that we can make use of for, picking various ideas on the banjo and stroke style. Let's move to the D shape chord. I'm going to stay with G major, and this is the D formation, or what I like to call the number 2 formation for G major. And I want to use the zoom feature so we can get a better shot of what's going on the fingerboard. Now, this would be the full-blown shape, and the first and second string is going to be the first place that we're going to look at making a partial position out of this chord. So if I remove the other 2 fingers that I need to play the chord, I wind up with this. These 2 notes, the second and the first string at 8 and 9 for G, for the example, is probably the most common chord partial in all of Scruggs banjo playing. Now, something interesting happens when most Scruggs players decide to use this partial. They will adopt this fingering, and you might think, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't I want to use the same 2 fingers that are in the full-blown chord shape to hold these 2 notes? If I'm only going to play these 2 notes, why wouldn't I use the same fingers that I use for the full chord? Well, there's a pretty good reason for it. For one thing, it feels really strange, really weird to do this. It looks weird, and it doesn't give you any flexibility as far as to how to add notes or take notes away from this position to come up with some of the interesting Scruggs licks that you hear players play. So what happens is Scruggs players adopt the fingering that Earl used, which is this. And that might look strange, and you might think, well, okay, John, why would I do that? Well, this affords you some extra flexibility. It allows you to maneuver around and play some of these licks and some of these ideas that you hear. And this is sometimes referred to as the Cumberland Gap or the Sally Gooden position, because when you learn those songs, you will be needing this chord partial to play that classic Scruggs solo. So now again, this is universal. Any chord shape that uses this formation, D formation, can be moved anywhere on the neck, and you can make this same familiar partial out of it. But since we're talking about G here for the example, I'm going to stick with G. So what happens is you have 2 notes that you can roll over, and then you can add notes with the pinky and the ring. And if you've heard any Scruggs style banjo at all, even if you're a beginner with these things, you will recognize those sounds, because it's an integral part of what makes stroke style sound the way it is the use of chord partials. So if I had to rate a chord partial as being the most important one to learn in the beginning when you're new at this kind of thing, it would be to learn the Cumberland Gap position, because it is probably the most used chord partial in all Scruggs banjo playing. Now, I'm not going to go into specific licks or ideas you can play with that, but I just want you to be conscious of the fingering and why you're doing it, because I've seen players that think, well, I'm going to be different, I'm going to adopt my own fingering for this. If you were just going to roll those notes, then you don't really need to change anything. You can even leave the fingers of the chord that are not being used in place, and it doesn't affect the tone of anything. It may stop you from accidentally hitting a string and making it ring out, but as far as what's happening when you roll the position, yeah, you could use any fingers you want. But if you're going to play some of these classic Scruggs licks and some of these classic solos, you need to adopt index and ring for this particular partial. So even if you decide to move it around the neck to different keys, you'll find that using these 2 fingers, index and ring, are going to be the most valuable way to finger this position. Now what about some other positions that we could play out of the D-shaped formation? Well, I'll zoom back in again. So we have the Cumberland Gap / Sally Gooden partial position. You can also play any of the notes in combination out of the chord. 1 and 3 is always a very valuable chord partial that you can play. You can roll over it, you can tremolo it. Some players like Don Reno, who I'm going to talk about in the next video, would make use of this position. It's common to hear these two notes played in backup. You can play solos, you can play melody, where one of the notes of the chord is the melody string and the other note is a harmony. Just like we did for the F-shaped G formation, we played 1 and 3. That chord partial is also valuable. It's the same two strings but a slightly different arrangement of the notes. So you see out of the D-shaped G, I'm playing 1 and 3, and they're 2 frets apart because they're based on the shape. Out of the F shape, those two notes are only 1 fret apart. But it's the same two strings, just 2 different notes. Now you can also play the 4th and 3rd strings together as a group, or as a partial, I should say. But they're a lot less commonly used in stroke style. Traditional stroke players probably wouldn't feature these two notes, as a partial position. But again, when you're playing these things, you can still play stroke style and still use your own imagination. You're not limited to doing just what other stroke players do. You can also play 4 and 1 as a partial, but that becomes what's known as an octave. 2 notes that are the same note, an octave apart. But any combination of a chord that's broken up into pieces can be considered a chord partial. So for strokes players, the very first partial that you may ever learn on the banjo in this style of playing would be the Cumberland Gap chord partial position. And then the next one may be 1 and 3 out of the D shape. So all these things work together to help you play the ideas that you want to play. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and use some ideas from the previous video, and then I'm going to slide up the neck and combine it with ideas from our second inversion, the D shape, and see what kind of interesting sounds we can come up with. So all I did was basically just doodle around with some of the partials that we talked about. Some of them I didn't use at all, but I tried to stick with the ones I thought you'd be most familiar with if you listen to this style of banjo. So you can create solos with these ideas. You can use the chord partials for the F and the D to play backup licks. There's a lot of different uses for these partials. And remember that the partials are all universally usable. I don't know if that's a good terminology or not, but they're movable because you're basing them on a chord shape. The only thing that will get you in trouble when you try to move these positions around is if you accidentally hit an open string, like the open 5th. So I can take this chord partial that we used here, the Sally Gooden position, I can move it up to, I don't know, G sharp. But if I accidentally hit an open string, may get some strange sounds because the open 5th may or may not harmonize with those two notes. So if you're not sure whether the 5th string or any open string will work while you're holding one of these partial positions, then don't play that string. So a good rule of thumb is, when in doubt, lay out, is what I like to say. So if you don't think the 5th string will work, or the open 3rd string, or whatever open string you're trying to use, if you don't think it will work, don't play that string. So there are some partials for you to mess around with out of the D formation. We'll see you next week. We'll look at the bar chord. Thanks. Appreciate it.